I love disturbing films, and I don't say that lightly. I've seen a ton of films over the years that many people consider to be disturbing, and while a lot of them don't usually make me feel something, some still are able to get under my skin. But while I've seen a lot of disturbing films, what I haven't really ventured into are the top of the top. The films that are considered taboo by many, and generally are not as well received. While some of these films are still quite popular and get tons of praise, many of these disturbing films are thrown to the wayside as being too much for most people, or are just dismissed as torture porn. And I've watched tons of these, but what I really wanted to see was just how far cinema could push me and the feelings it could make me have. And disturbing films usually do that much better than all the others, with some of the most visceral emotions I've ever felt coming from disturbing films that I've seen. But here's the thing, what exactly do we consider a disturbing film? Well, for me, I consider disturbing to be much more of a visceral realism. This is much different than something like a typical horror film, which I would consider to be scary, but disturbing has much more of a mature and realistic tone to it. For example, while I would consider films like The Exorcist to be frightening and scary, I would not exactly consider it disturbing whatsoever. See, for a film to be disturbing in my eyes, it's gotta have some plausibility to it, and generally has to be much more thought-provoking and horrific. And in this series, I'll be taking a look at what are considered the tippy top of the most disturbing films and looking at these, and while I've seen quite a few, there's still quite a few gaps of ones that I have not seen. And for this ranking, I'll be using two different scores. One will be a tier list itself, which I'll rank with 6 categories. First off, there's the category of will stick with your mind for years, which is the worst of the worst. These are the films that no matter how hard you try, you'll never be able to forget them, and they will stick in your mind for a while. Then there's traumatizing, and while these films might sound the same as the first, while some films I would consider traumatizing, I am still able to go about my day afterwards. That's where this category comes into play, as while these films are truly excruciating to sit through, the emotions I feel from watching them slowly disappear by the next day, and I somewhat forget about them. Then there's disturbing, which are films that I consider to be disturbing, but don't really stick with me in the way that the more traumatizing ones do, with an example of the ones I would consider in this level that's not on here being 2005's Lady Vengeance. And for those who have seen that film, you know exactly what that ranking means. As while it's disturbing, I really wouldn't consider it to be at the very top, as I can still go about my day afterwards without thinking too much about what I just witnessed. This is where the vast majority of the films will be here, as while I find a lot of films to be disturbing, many of them don't really stick with me in the way that tons of others do. Then there's Getting There, which is mainly for films that while they are shocking, I wouldn't really call them disturbing per se, but they are not far off. This is where I would put films like The Silence of the Lambs or Link Mungo, as while they have the visceral realism that makes a film disturbing, I feel like they have a level of disconnect to them that these others don't have. Then for the final two categories, I feel like there's pretty self-explanatory. For not disturbing, these are films that I of course did not find disturbing at all, and then for not watching these, there's quite a few films here that I don't really want to watch, not because of them being too much, but because they just don't seem like pleasant experiences at all to watch. These are films that almost feel like snuff films or extreme porn, and honestly, I really don't want to watch that. I want the films to still feel like a cinematic experience, so if that's not that, I'm not going to watch it. And then for the second half of the ranking, I'm going to include a score out of 10, which is my review score of whether I think the film is actually good or not. While a lot of these films may rank high in the disturbing category, I don't know if I could classify them as actually good movies or not. So to make up for that, I'm going to include a score at the very end of each section. And for this week, we're going to be looking at these 4 films: 1980's Altered States, 2013's The Green Inferno, 1972's Deliverance, and 1991's Begotten. But before getting into them, mild spoiler warnings for all these films. If you haven't seen them and plan on watching them, click off or skip to the next section, and I will also include mild triggers for each section. Okay, now let's quit explaining and get into the actual ranking. I don't say this often, but I really enjoyed my time with Deliverance despite it not aging particularly well. But don't get me wrong, this film is not the easiest watch, even to this very day, but compared to a lot of the other films we will be getting into later, Deliverance is much more doable for the average audience member. See, Deliverance stars Jon Voight and Burt Reynolds as they go on a canoeing trip through the Appalachian Mountains. During the first day, however, they are cornered by a pair of quote-unquote mountain men who are planning to rob them. This leads to why the film is so infamous, the famous squeal like a pig scene, which I really cannot describe here in this video due to the extremely graphic nature of it. What's surprising though is while this scene is extremely disturbing, the rest of it's just a typical suspense thriller. But this one singular sequence was enough to make the film just as memorable as it is. Which makes sense, as this film was released in 1972, which while the exploitation films were getting started, they were still quite in their infancy. So this scene must have been absolutely shocking when it came out, just like another film that released that year, which we'll be getting to at some point. And I should say, before we get any further, many of the films I'll be talking about have shocking shocking and triggering content, so as at the very beginning, seriously, viewer discretion is advised. I will try my best to portray these in a way that will hopefully not trigger you, but if you want to check these films out on your own time, then you have been warned. This movie especially so, as the content in that one sequence got more of a reaction out of me personally than a lot of the other films are able to do as a whole. So would I consider this movie disturbing? Yes, most definitely, but unlike a lot of the other ones I'll be covering, this is a must-watch as well. This film's atmosphere is amazing, with every single drop of tension that could be used being taken advantage of, and while it may not be the best film on this tier list, I still thoroughly enjoyed my time with Deliverance. The scenes on the river are especially tense, as the film makes us believe that our four guys are being watched by the same group and is picking them off one by one. But also at the same time, it makes us wonder if that's what's really going on here, or are these four men just paranoid from the trauma that they have witnessed. It's excellently shot and paced out, and while the ending does drag slightly, it could have been much worse, and because of that, I would personally give this film a 7.5 out of 10. But where would it rank and how disturbing it was? Well, I personally would put this film in the disturbing category, as while I would consider the film to be disturbing, it's not as bad as the ones in the top two tiers. There is much worse on this list, and this is just more of a midpoint of how disturbing it's going to get. Also, mileage may vary with how disturbing you find this one, because if the subject matter in that one scene doesn't necessarily bother you, you might find this film to be relatively tame. It all depends on where your weak points are. I really tried to enjoy this movie, and there were aspects of it that I actually did like while watching, but my god, this movie did absolutely nothing for me. I've tried watching it time after time over the years, and while I enjoyed the more experimental stylings and horror sometimes, this one just really didn't do much for me. See, the film follows a scientist, Dr. Jessup, as he puts himself into an isolation chamber while on psychedelics to see what would happen with his mind. And weird trippy visuals and body horror follows, and while I did enjoy a lot of the visuals on their own, as one completed work, it just didn't do much for me. Don't get me wrong though, this is a visually stunning film with a lot of visuals seeming almost like paintings rather than a film, and the religious imagery is quite disturbing, although it doesn't really bother me too much, with one of the most iconic shots being him on a cross with a goat head. It makes sense why it's on here because of that imagery, but for me personally, this film hardly disturbed me at all. I tried to get dragged into the world that Ken Russell was creating, but the stylization made it so I was too busy focusing on the imagery to really feel anything about our characters and their suffering. And I know this is probably a hot take, as Altered States has had a ton of influence on body horror over the years and it's extremely obvious. Hell, you can tell that Cronenberg definitely borrowed a lot of the elements from this film for his 80s films. However, I think for body horror in the 80s that Cronenberg still does it better, which is honestly quite surprising because the script here is great, being written by the guy who did Network and who died directly after this film was released, this being his very last script. But as a whole, I hate to say it, but I found the film to be rather cheesy, and I know it's a weird thing for me to say as it seems like it would be just up my alley, but honestly I did not care for these characters at all, and the extremely dated early 80s CGI was not helping. I really tried to enjoy myself with it, but this one is just going to have to be a hard pass for me. Although for some fun trivia, the sequence at the end of the movie with the hallway is a direct inspiration on this little music video called Take On Me, which is hilarious to me. So would I label this film disturbing? Well, not exactly. I could see how someone could find it disturbing, but this film for me didn't really do anything. So I would honestly put this on the not disturbing tier, as while I did find some parts of it frightening, I really could not say I was disturbed. Now others might find this film extremely disturbing, but for me personally, ranking it, I just can't give it any higher. I'm honestly surprised it's on here due to just how tame it is compared to a lot of the others on here. And for my review score, I would give it a 5 out of 10, as while I personally didn't enjoy it, I can still see the art here. This film is still technically excellent even if it didn't do anything for me. This film goes into one of my least favorite categories of disturbing films, where yes, the imagery here is quite disturbing, but my god, this film is incredibly boring. Another heavily experimental film, I tried figuring out what it meant, but I really couldn't gather any idea of what the hell I was seeing. I looked at the plot, and honestly, I think they are full of shit because I have no idea what they saw to come up with that meaning. This film just seems to be a bunch of shocking visuals, with the most famous being at the very end, with a dude tied up and something crawling out from his stomach or ripping him open. It's a disturbing visual, sure, but what the actual hell does any of it mean? I tried my hardest to gather or any sort of understanding of what this film could possibly mean, but I really could not find any meaning whatsoever. This film is just a splatter-filled mess that really made no sense to me whatsoever. I've always heard that this would be the most disturbing film I've ever seen, and after watching it, I have no idea what they were possibly seeing there. While the visuals are certainly up there, it lacks any of the weight that makes the top tier disturbing films as disturbing as they are, so while it's on the upper end of disturbing visuals, it's nowhere near as effective as the disturbing films I would put up in the shocking or traumatizing films. As well, visually I would say it gets close, we just don't have the emotional weight of the films that are in the top tier. See, while a lot of the visuals in the films can be disturbing for most people, they may not leave the lasting impact of the ones in those top tiers. So you may notice in the rankings that a lot of the films that have the most disturbing visuals might not be in those top tiers because they lack the emotional weight to make those visuals as disturbing as possible. You also see films with less disturbing visuals but more emotionally disturbing being up there, as while they may not be as visually disturbing as films like this one, they may have some extra weight that the visuals that are disturbing hit so much harder. And so because of that, I would give this film the getting there ranking and a 2 out of 10, as while it's trying its hardest to disturb me, it just doesn't reach the height of the others. And the film as a whole is a scattered mess, so its ranking is quite low as I truly had no idea what the hell was going on throughout the entirety of the runtime. Eli Roth has got to be one of the most divisive horror filmmakers out right now, as whether or not his films are just torture porn or more nuanced than they seem is still up to be decided. For me, he always seems like one of those directors who always tries to tackle more than he seems capable of, and Green Inferno seems like another example of this. He seems to be quite ambitious with the ideas he's tackling, with this film tackling the idea of deforestation of the Amazon and the way it could affect the local tribes within the area. The film follows a group of college volunteers who fly down to stop the deforestation from hurting one of the tribes down there, but find out that the tribe is cannibalistic. But here's the thing, Eli Roth cannot write likable characters for the life of him, with nearly all of this film suffering from this. And because of this, a lot of the scenes, while disturbing, are nowhere near as disturbing as they could be considering just how visceral the gore is within the film. This film is nowhere near an easy watch, but when you compare it to the film that it's based on, that being Cannibal Holocaust, this film is nowhere near as impactful. And honestly, that's one of the main things that keeps me from putting it in the higher two categories, because this film is nearly there. And honestly, while I found the film to be extremely disturbing, due to me not caring about the characters hardly at all, I honestly found films like Bone Tomahawk, which is surprisingly not on this list I'm using, to be much more impactful with the way that the disturbing content is portrayed. Both have a very similar level of gore, but because we care about the characters that much more, the impact of the gore is much better. But because of all of that, I really can only give the film the disturbing characterization. It's not as disturbing to me as the films that would go into the top two tiers, but while it may not be there, do be warned, all these films I've talked about today are not for the faint of heart, and I would give this film a 4 out of 10. So in conclusion, while many of these films are quite disturbing, we haven't seen any so far that have reached my top tiers. Will that change next week, or will it be more of the same? Find out next week, and make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss it. And this has been ABA Short Films, and I'll see you all next week.